My parents secretly canceled my dream college application to protect my brother, so my grandparents gave me everything instead. Hey everyone, so something wild happened recently. My parents got hit with some serious consequences for the way they messed me over, and I'll be honest, I didn't feel one bit bad for them. I actually told them flat out they deserved every bit of what happened, and yeah, I kind of gloated about it. I felt like I earned that moment. But now a few of my friends are saying maybe I went too far, that maybe it wasn't necessary. Anyway, I'm 17, a guy, and I'm supposed to be starting college in a couple of weeks. I'd applied to several business schools out of state because, to be real, I wanted as much distance from my parents as possible. I didn't think they'd miss me either, and turns out, I was right. But even so, they still managed to go behind my back and withdraw my application from my top choice school. I only found out about it recently, and to make it worse, it was all because of my brother. My brother, he's this insecure, jealous mess who just can't stand to see me doing well or being happy. He's been flunking school for a few years now. Doesn't matter how much effort he claims to put in, he's always falling short. And I think I know why. The truth is, he cares way more about impressing the cool kids and putting on a show than actually focusing on his studies. But for some reason, my parents are blind to all of that. I've literally never seen him crack open a book at home, and that's a big part of the issue. Instead of holding him accountable, my parents started dragging him around to all these specialists over the last couple months, trying to figure out if he's got some kind of learning disability that's making it hard for him to succeed. Apparently, his high school counselor sat them down and warned them he's doing terribly in school, and if he doesn't step it up soon, he's not getting into any decent college. He's just 2 years away from graduation, and the only thing waiting for him at this rate is community college. And that was the wake-up call that finally got my parents involved. I guess the idea of their precious son ending up in community college was just too much for them to bear. Honestly, I didn't care. Let them make all the excuses they want for their golden boy. His mess wasn't mine to worry about. I had my own future to think about, and I wanted to make sure I got into a solid business program so I could build a good life for myself and stay far away from my family drama. That's why I applied to Stanford too. I mean, everyone knows Stanford is a big deal. My grades were pretty solid, and some of my friends even told me they thought I had a shot. So I figured, why not? Even if I didn't get in, at least I could say I tried. But apparently, my parents weren't too happy about that. Turns out, just a few days after I sent in my Stanford application, they logged into my email, pretending to be me, and withdrew it. I had absolutely no idea they did this. Lately, I've been hearing back from most of the schools I apply to, and the good news is I've been accepted into quite a few of them. So when the time comes, I'll have options. But something kept bugging me. I hadn't heard a single thing from Stanford. Not even a rejection. And usually, schools send something, even if it's a no. It started to feel off. My friends kept asking me about it too, and I was getting uncomfortable not having any updates to give them. So I decided to check my application status on Stanford's portal, but I couldn't find anything. That's when I really started to worry. I even searched through my entire email inbox, including the spam folder, and came up empty. So finally, I called their admissions office, thinking maybe there'd been some kind of technical glitch. Later that day, they called me back, and that's when I found out the truth. They told me that someone had emailed them, claiming to be me, and officially withdrew my application. That's why they never reached out. I was stunned. At first, I didn't believe it. I told them there had to be some mistake because I clearly remembered submitting my application. But they insisted they got the withdrawal email just days after I applied, so they closed my file. They couldn't talk much longer, since they had work to do, so I hung up, completely rattled. I spent the whole day in shock, searching for any explanation that might make sense. But there was nothing. Eventually, I had to face the reality: someone sabotaged me. At first, my mind immediately went to my brother. I couldn't think of anyone else who'd be that jealous of me to actually pull something like this. But then I second-guessed myself. He was acting the same around me as always: loud, arrogant, and irritating. But if he had done it, I figured he'd be rubbing it in my face by now. And he wasn't. So I started to wonder if it really was him after all. Still, a couple days later, I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. I needed answers, so I went straight to his room and asked him about it. At first, he just looked really confused, and honestly, it seemed genuine. But I don't trust him, not even a little, so I pushed harder. That's when he got pissed. He started yelling, saying he didn't even know how to get into my email. And then he added that if he had known how, he would have withdrawn all my applications just so I wouldn't be running around the house celebrating every time an acceptance letter showed up. That hit a nerve. I was already on edge, and hearing him say that pushed me over. We both started yelling, and then it turned into a full-on physical fight. When our parents heard the commotion, they came running in to break it up. I don't even know what came over me. I felt like I lost it. Maybe it was the frustration building up, knowing that someone had deliberately tried to screw me over. Things like that don't just happen randomly. I was furious, and I guess I just snapped and took it out on him. My parents were trying their hardest to pull me off my brother, but I was completely losing it. I was going after him like a wild animal. It got so bad that my dad had to physically hold me back. That's when my mom blurted out something I wasn't expecting at all. She said it wasn't my brother who had withdrawn my Stanford application, it was them. I just froze. Everything in me stopped. I wasn't even mad at my brother anymore because, in that moment, I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. Betrayal doesn't even begin to cover it. I felt blindsided, like the floor had dropped out from under me. Nobody said a word for a few seconds. We all just stood there in stunned silence. I was trying to come up with something to say, trying to wrap my head around it, but there was nothing. I was completely in shock. When I didn't say anything, my mom started to cry and tried to explain. She told me that both she and my dad had access to my email, which honestly didn't surprise me. Before I got my own laptop, I used to use my dad's computer for everything. And when I finally got my own, I guess I never thought to log out from any shared accounts. It hadn't seemed like a big deal back then. All of this apparently went down right around the time my brother's high school counselor had warned my parents that if he didn't get his act together, he'd have no option but to go to community college. It had gotten pretty bad. And to make things worse, the counselor compared him to me. We went to the same school, and she told my parents I had a lot of promising options, that I wanted to go to business school and was already well on my way. But my brother? Not so much. She thought maybe it would help if he talked to me, tried to follow the same path I was on, maybe even have me tutor him a little. I know she meant well, she had no idea how strained things were between me and my brother. But my parents took it the wrong way. Instead of encouraging him to work harder, they started thinking he was falling apart from the pressure of being compared to me. They started to worry that maybe he felt like he'd never measure up. And then, instead of actually parenting him, they decided I was the problem. My dad suggested checking my email just to see where I was applying, since I hadn't shared any of that with them. He said they just wanted to make sure I wasn't applying to unrealistic places that would only widen the gap between me and my brother. Most of the schools I applied to seemed fine to them, apparently. But when they saw Stanford on the list, everything changed. That's when they convinced themselves that if I got in, it would destroy my brother emotionally. They pictured him spending the rest of his life being compared to the golden child who made it into Stanford. So instead of talking to me, their own son, they talked about it behind my back for a few days. Then, my mom came up with the brilliant idea of just withdrawing the application altogether. She figured they had access to my email, they had the application ID and everything, so they could quietly pull the plug. It would be sneaky and totally unethical, sure, but they thought it would help the situation. Help my brother, at least. They kept tossing the idea around for a few more days and eventually decided to go through with it. They withdrew my application while it was still in process. Then, to make sure I wouldn't find out, they deleted the confirmation emails and covered their tracks. They got lucky that I never checked the application portal myself, because I just assumed all updates would come through email, which is how it usually goes. On top of that, I'd been swamped with finals, and I was juggling applications to other colleges too. I wasn't cocky enough to think I'd automatically get into Stanford, so I had a bunch of backups. All that stuff took time and energy, and I'd been really overwhelmed the past few months. Unfortunately, that meant I never noticed what they'd done until it was too late. When my mom finally finished spilling everything, both she and my dad tried to come over and comfort me. Even my brother looked kind of stunned. They said they were sorry. They told me they didn't mean for it to hurt me so much, that they'd just been focused on helping my brother and hadn't really thought through how it would affect me. And even after all that, they still tried to justify it. They really believed that if I had gotten into Stanford, it would have been too much for my brother to handle emotionally. But I didn't want to hear any of it. I'd heard enough. I shook them off and walked out of the room without saying anything. I locked myself in mine and immediately started packing. I couldn't stay in that house another minute, not after what they did. They kept knocking, trying to talk to me, asking me to come out, but I wasn't having it. Once I packed whatever I could carry, I ordered a cab. I didn't even look at them while I walked out the door. They kept trying to say something, but I ignored every word. I just got in the car and left. I headed to my grandparents' place, my dad's parents. They live pretty close, and I knew I couldn't go to my mom's side of the family since they live farther away. As soon as I got there, I told them everything. I let it all out and told them I had no plans of going back home. They already knew things weren't great between me and my parents. They'd always sensed that my parents played favorites with my brother, but this? This was a whole new level. When I told them what happened, my grandpa completely lost it. My grandma tried to soothe me because I finally broke down and cried at their place. I hadn't let myself cry until I got there. While I was sobbing, I could hear my grandpa in the other room, yelling at my parents over the phone. I could tell they were still trying to defend themselves, trying to make it sound like it wasn't as bad as it was, but my grandpa wasn't buying any of it. He tore into them hard. After my grandpa got done yelling at my parents, I heard him get on another call. This time, though, he was a lot calmer, more civil. He was explaining the whole situation to someone, though I couldn't tell who it was. When he finally came back to the living room, he sat down next to me with my grandma and just stayed there to comfort me. By then, I had stopped crying. I'd pulled myself together a bit, but I was still emotionally drained. That's when my grandpa told me that my other set of grandparents, my mom's parents, were coming over the next day. He said once everyone was together, they'd figure out what to do and how to move forward. He reassured me and told me not to worry, that he'd take care of everything. I wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that, but honestly, I was too tired to even ask. The next day, just like he said, my other grandparents showed up. With everyone finally in the same room, they all took turns comforting me and letting me know that they were going to do everything they could to fix this mess. I mean, they were realistic. They knew it was probably too late to get me into Stanford, but they promised they'd cover all my college expenses, including tuition and living costs, wherever I ended up going. That was a massive relief. College isn't cheap, and my parents had made it clear from the beginning that I'd have to either work through school or take out student loans. I'd already planned to do both, take out a loan and maybe get a part-time job to cover the rest. That had always been the deal for both me and my brother. In fact, it was probably the only thing my parents were ever fair about. They weren't planning on paying for either of us. Although, looking at my brother's grades, I doubt they'll ever have to shell out a dime for his education anyway. But my grandparents? They stepped up big time. They told me they'd take care of everything. I was beyond grateful. But then they hit me with something even bigger. Apparently, the night before, while I'd been asleep, they'd all sat down together and had a serious talk. They'd come to the conclusion that what my parents did was so beyond unacceptable that they didn't even want to have a relationship with them anymore. They said they were going to speak to their lawyers and change their wills, completely cutting my parents out. Instead, they were going to name me as the sole heir. That honestly blew my mind. I did not see that coming at all. I didn't even know what to say. I tried to thank them, even though words felt kind of small compared to what they were offering me. But they stopped me. They told me I didn't need to thank them, that they should be the ones apologizing for not raising better children who could have been better parents to me. Even though I was feeling a little more okay by then, I could tell they were still really upset, probably even more disappointed in my parents than I was. Still, I kept thanking them and tried to be upbeat around them. I didn't want them to feel any worse than they already did, and I could tell it helped lift the mood a little. That was 3 days ago, and since then I've been staying at my grandparents' place. My parents had tried to stop me when I walked out, but after I left, they didn't try to reach out. Not right away, anyway. My mom's parents are still staying here with us for a little while, but they'll be heading back home at the end of the week. They mostly came just to make sure I was okay. Now that they've seen I'm doing alright, they're ready to go back. But last night, things took a turn. I got a call from my parents, and it wasn't to apologize. Nope, it was to blame me. They called me a snitch. Apparently, just a few hours earlier, all 4 of my grandparents had contacted them and told them straight up how disgusted and disappointed they were. They said they didn't want any further contact and had already started the process of removing them from their wills. And they told them that everything would go to me instead because I'd actually earned it. After pretending to be sorry when I first confronted them, my parents' true colors came out last night. They were nasty, bitter, and honestly kind of cruel. They started demanding that I call my grandparents and fix it, saying there was no way they'd let me walk away with everything. And I won't lie, I gloated. I told them they had no one to blame but themselves, and I was glad they were finally facing the consequences. I said I was grateful my grandparents had decided to cut them out not just of their wills, but of their lives. I also let them know my college expenses were being fully covered now, and they could keep coddling my brother all they wanted. But seeing as he wasn't likely to get into college, they could probably hang on to their retirement savings. And then I said the thing that really set them off. I told them not to be too upset, because when they're old and broke, I'd be more than happy to connect them with some charities that help out the destitute. I figured most of their money would go into taking care of my brother for the rest of his life anyway, and with no inheritance coming their way, they'd better start saving or start praying. That was it. That was the last straw for them. They started yelling like crazy, just straight up screaming and cussing me out. I couldn't even understand what they were saying anymore, so I hung up. Then I blocked their number. And honestly, that part felt pretty satisfying. But here's where I might have messed up. I told a few of my friends about it. I thought they'd get it. They know everything I'd been through, so I figured they'd be on my side. But instead, they told me I'd gone too far. That I could have just taken the win and walked away with some dignity instead of rubbing it in. We ended up arguing about it, and now I feel kind of bad. I don't think my grandparents know anything about that conversation yet, because they haven't said a word. But I'm nervous to bring it up. I don't want to come off like I'm being arrogant or ungrateful. I honestly don't know how to feel right now. So, am I the jerk for gloating in front of my parents? Now that I know all of my grandparents' inheritance is going to me, yeah, I'd be lying if I said that doesn't feel pretty satisfying. Quick side note, I've never had a good relationship with my brother. Not now, not ever. A big part of that is because of how my parents have always favored him, but honestly, he's not innocent either. He's a total wannabe, acts like a big shot, and from what I've heard, he's a bit of a bully at school too, which is honestly just embarrassing for me. He's never treated me with an ounce of kindness, even when we were little kids. So yeah, I've got bad blood with him just like I do with our parents. Now, for the folks asking why my grandparents never stepped in sooner or tried to get custody of me, well, it's not like there was anything they could legally do. My parents weren't neglecting me or locking me in a basement or anything like that. Sure, things were tense and strained, but it wasn't the kind of situation a court would consider for removing custody. And let's be real, my parents wouldn't have willingly given me up either. That would have looked bad on them, and their image has always been everything to them. So my grandparents didn't have the power to rescue me, and honestly, I didn't even think about leaving until recently. I just accepted my life for what it was and figured I'd tough it out until college, when I could finally move out and breathe. Hope that clears things up about why I've been so bitter toward my brother, and why I didn't leave home earlier. Update 1. So after reading a bunch of comments and really thinking about things, I've decided I don't owe anyone, especially not my friends, any explanation for how I handled things. Most of them come from good homes where they've been treated well, and they have no idea what I've lived through. If I want to gloat a little, I'm going to do it. I've earned that. It's not like I called my parents just to rub it in their faces. They called me. All I did was match their energy, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I actually talked to my grandparents about it today. They told me I probably should have just blocked the number, but they didn't seem upset that I spoke to my parents the way I did. In fact, they said my parents kind of earned it with the way they've treated me. It's been 3 days since that phone call, and I haven't heard from my parents again. I'm hoping it stays that way. My maternal grandparents left earlier today, and I was a little sad to see them go. I don't get to spend much time with them. But they promised they'd be back, and all 4 of my grandparents are planning to come with me when I leave for college. That really means a lot. Update 2. Okay, so I might have spoken too soon about my parents staying away. Today, they actually showed up at my grandparents' house, probably thinking they could talk their way back into the inheritance. Which is laughable. What they don't get is, you can't just show up and demand something like that. And if they had even a shred of self-awareness, they'd know to come in with an apology, at least pretend they were sorry. But no, they came in with the worst attitude. The moment they stepped onto the porch, they started arguing with my grandparents. When they saw me standing in the back, I told my grandparents they should just shut the door and not even engage. That's when my mom looked at me and actually called me a cuss word. Then she had the nerve to say I was a selfish brat for snitching on them over something like this, she said. Then she went even further and told me I wasn't even good enough to get into Stanford, so I needed to stop acting like some kind of victim. That one hit a nerve, hard. I didn't want to say anything to them, but I lost it. I screamed back that maybe I could have gotten in if they hadn't sabotaged me. If they hadn't let their own insecurities ruin my chances. Once my grandparents saw I was getting too worked up, they shut the door and told my parents to leave or they'd call the cops. But of course, my parents just stood outside yelling about how unfair it all was. My dad tried to act like he was the voice of reason, saying they'd only withdrawn my application to protect my brother's mental health. Like that somehow made it okay. Eventually, my grandpa got fed up and just turned on the sprinklers. That finally got them to leave. He told me that next time they show up uninvited, he won't hesitate to call the cops right away. And I believe him. That gave me some peace of mind. I know I could have just stayed out of it and let them yell from the porch, but in a way, it felt good to get those words out of my system. Update 3. It's been a few months since all of that happened, and I haven't had any direct interaction with my parents since. My grandpa did tell me they showed up once more, but he followed through. He called the cops and had them removed from the property. I wasn't even home when it happened. I was out with some friends, not the ones who judged me before. I'm not in touch with them anymore, and honestly, I'm fine with that. Life feels a lot simpler when you cut out the people who don't have your back. Right now, I only stay in touch with a few close friends and, of course, my grandparents. A lot of our extended family isn't speaking to my parents anymore either. Most of them don't even know the full story, but they know enough to keep their distance. I started college about 3 weeks ago, and so far, it's been amazing. I've made a bunch of new friends, and the classes are really interesting. I know it's going to be a lot of work, but I'm ready for that. I want to build a good future, not just for myself, but so I can give back to my grandparents for everything they've done for me. They really saved me when I needed it most. And you know what? Even though I didn't end up at Stanford, I'm still at a pretty solid college. It's a good fit. I'm happy, and I know I'm going to make the most of it.